Transnet is still reeling from what it says was a sabotage on its coal lines into Richards Bay. It discovered late last week that one of the lines had been severed using a blowtorch. 51 of a 200-strong wagon train derailed. No injuries or environmental damage, but the company was forced to activate a clause rendering its rail operations blameless. I'm joined now in studio by Transnet's acting GCEO, Morwe. Thanks indeed, Mr. Morwe, for joining us.
Thank you.
Of course, not a very Merry Christmas for anyone expecting that coal, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, it's actually a blemish on the country's brand, given the fact that customers are expecting coal to be delivered, and we can't deliver.
You call this economic sabotage, and I asked you off air, who would do this and why?
Well, at this particular point in time, one can't attribute any motive to any individual or group of individuals. But if you look at it, there would be a number of interested parties, because once such a massive derailment occurs, people would have to come in and clear the wagons, would have to come in and clear the coal, would have to fix the line, assist Transnet in fixing the line. So there's a lot of money in that. It could be that, or one would hope that it's not what would be termed political sabotage. I don't think it's that, at least at this point.
So how do you deal with this? I mean, surely there's an investigation to find out exactly, who's done it, why. You've alluded to the fact that there could be some services rendered here when such a thing happens. What sort of trail do you follow?
Well, without revealing much, the police are looking at it. They would have to go to the scene, look at what happened, and then, using certain technologies, try to determine the people who had been around the area when this happened. Yeah.
So I see you've activated a clause which renders Transnet blameless in terms of the sort of economic consequences here, but surely there's a lot of money. A client was waiting for this call. What sort of numbers are we looking at here in terms of what we've lost?
Well, I mean, if you look at the week in terms of the coal that gets delivered to RBCT, you're looking at about 1.7 million tons. But the coal line not only runs coal. I mean, you've got timber, you've got chrome, and then you've got coal going through what we call RBTG, which is a Grindrod-owned terminal. So for Transnet, you would looking at anything for the few days, about 250 million upwards. For customers,
that's over a few days, a period of few days.
Yeah, for the few, let's say 4 days now, and then obviously customers can sell the coal, and the taxman can recover the tax for coal that can be sold.
So that addresses the coal incident that happened last week. But I mean, the question is whether or not we've fixed the line back into Richards Bay, and what are the potential losses? Because as you just said, it's not just coal that enters Richards Bay. You've got iron ore, and we've seen frustrations even before, without an incident, with the sort of slow movement of some of these things. What's the future looking like in the next few days for shipments going into this port?
Well, Line 2 is operational. It started operating yesterday. We estimate that by 9 in the morning, Line 1 would be running. But normally what happens is we would then have to wait for the infrastructure to set before we can, be at full operations.
So, Mr. Morwe, this is one of the derailments you are dealing with at Transnet. I mean, this is one of them. There are many. For example, since coming on board as acting CEO last month, I mean, one of the things that made news a couple of weeks ago was the fact that you've taken to the courts to get the Gupta-linked trillion to pay back some millions of rands. How's that going?
Discussions are ongoing, between the lawyers. Even with the OEMs, discussions are currently ongoing. I think in the new year, we will engage in full negotiations. in terms of what is to be paid, in terms of looking at local content and so forth.
So who exactly is Transnet speaking to, and what sort of money are we looking at here?
Well, I mean, you mentioned, trillion. They're the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, China South Rail, North Rail, and the money would be determined in negotiations, with the affected parties in terms of what monies they received that they ought not to have received. So we'll still have to determine that.
On the issue of that 1,064 locomotives, I mean, you've said subsequent to your remarks on the court case that you don't see Transnet needing the entire amount of those locomotives. You could use some of that. Is that a tough contractual discussion to have with South Rail?
Look, I think we need to go back to the fact that because when the contracts were entered into, local content was not made part and parcel of the contract, we deemed the contract to be irregular and therefore illegal. So that's our approach. But rather than sitting down with the OEMs and negotiating to cancel or not to cancel, what we would have to do is to make a determination as to what does the business require. Do we need all 1064? Do we perhaps need 800? And then sit down with each OEM and negotiate what the requirements are. Because the contracts are illegal. I think that is the starting point. What we would then have to negotiate on is, well, let's re-enter into new contracts, into whatever number of locomotives we require.
This move is part and parcel of a broader cleanup that you've mentioned on corruption at Transnet, which has a history. In some state-owned enterprises, it's proven to be difficult to have a clean sweep instantaneously. How's that going?
Look, there are a number of forensic reports that are currently ongoing. Some have been completed. And what we are going to do in the new year is basically go back to the recommendations of the forensic reports and then start acting on those. I think that's the first part. The second part is to look at Transnet as an entity in terms of whether it's actually structurally fit for what it's supposed to do. Given the fact that in the past 2-3 years, we basically went off the rails. So we would have to revisit that. And I think by mid-year, we should know the direction that Transnet ought to go into. We should know how it ought to look like, its relationship with other entities such as PRASA and so forth.
And while considering all of this, I mean, you look at the fact that your profits have taken a bit of a beating, putting it mildly, by a weak economy, number one, and then you've got this finance costs to deal with. That's a tough challenge going into 2019.
Yeah, I think the other reason is, we need to start addressing issues of operational efficiencies.
Yep.
I think that's a big one. But the other issues such as finance costs and all of that, we just have to ensure that Transnet, from a governance point of view, we do what we're supposed to do. And then I think we'll be okay.
I mean, that's a story of just inspiring confidence and getting people to charge you a lower interest rate. It's the same thing just overall in terms of the economy. Is that a tough task to ask, someone lending you money?
Well, I must say that, I came into Transnet in November, and, I have to give credit to the acting, group CFO. I have to give credit to the board, that they've been able to go around the world and meet some of our lenders to clearly indicate that, look, Transnet is now changing, it's dealing with issues around governance and so forth. So at least we now have entities that are able to listen and able to say, look, if you need funds, let's talk.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Morwe. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. That's Transnet's acting GCEO,
Thank you.
Morwe.